Hello and welcome to World War II Part 3. World War II took place mostly in Europe, but the war caused changes all over the world. Have you ever wondered about what was happening back in the US during all the fighting? Well, wonder no more. This image focuses on the American Homefront, which is why it takes place in a cozy American home. See the big US flag rug in the middle of the room? That's your anchor for this image. Let's jump right in. First, take a look at the window where you can see a large factory outside. In order to make supplies for the war, manufacturing boomed. Next, take a look next to the factory where you'll see a strike sign in the trash can. This should help you remember that unions agreed not to strike during the war, which ensured a continuous supply of war products. Next, take a look at the poster next to the window. This is a famous poster and one you should know for your exam. The woman in the poster is named Rosie the Riveter, and it's a reference to how women entered the factories during the war. This helped keep up production of war supplies, as a lot of men were off fighting overseas. We put a vase of roses next to the poster to help you remember her name, Rosie. I also want to mention that a riveter is somebody who installs rivets. A rivet is a type of metal bolt. So somebody who rivets is someone who works in a factory. Next, take a look at the Native American who is talking to someone on the radio and coding in the corner. I wonder what he's coding in. Python? C++? Who knows? What I do know, though, is about Native American code talkers. During the war, the US had to send a lot of messages through the phone and radio. Back in those days, it was pretty easy to spy on these messages and listen in. To get around this, the US recruited Native Americans to help out. Before using the radio, the Native Americans would first translate important war messages into a Native American language. Native Americans on the other end of the radio could then decode and translate the messages back to English. Spies listening in didn't know how these Native American languages worked, so even if they could listen in, they didn't know what was being said. Next, take a look outside. There are a bunch of kids camping, which is to remind you of the Japanese American internment camps. Japan was a major enemy during the war. Think about Pearl Harbor. With this in mind, people were worried that Japanese Americans living in the US were actually spies for the Japanese government. The US thought the best thing to do was to put all these Japanese Americans in internment camps, which they did through the Executive Order Act. Look at the mom yelling at the kid who doesn't want to go camping. This mom refers to the Executive Order Act. The kid at the table is eating Japanese food, which should help you remember that this happened mostly to Japanese Americans. More specifically, he is eating curry from Matsu's restaurant, which should help you remember the name Korematsu. Get it? Curry Matsu? Korematsu was a Japanese American who refused to go to an internment camp, as he thought the relocation was unconstitutional. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, which is why the kid is wearing our recurring symbol for Supreme Court cases, a judge's wig. Korematsu lost the case though and was sent to a camp anyway, just like this kid's mom is going to force him to go camping outside. Next, take a look at the farmer next to the kid. He is wearing braces, which should help remind you of braceros. Remember, the US was short-staffed during the war since a lot of men were overseas. The bracero program offered a way to help. It offered temporary labor to Mexicans who wanted to come work in the US. Most of the work was agricultural, which is why this man is dressed like a farmer. These Mexican workers were called braceros. Next, notice the baggies of food the farmer put on the table. This is to remind you that the US heavily rationed supplies during the war, so they could send as much food as possible overseas. Next, take a look at the suave man in the suit. His name is James, but more importantly, he has a war bond in his hand. This is to remind you that the US sold war bonds in order to help pay for the war. Next, take a look at the much less suave man James is talking to. He is wearing a certain type of suit called a zoot suit. This is to remind you of the Zoot Suit riots, which was a race riot in 1943. He is eating a Mexican churro, which should help remind you that the Zoot Suit riots were a race riot against Mexican Americans. Our Zoot Suit man here may have been enjoying those churros a little too much, as he has just relieved himself in the middle of the room. The military man behind him is not happy about this. This should remind you that servicemen in California disliked young Mexican Americans who often wore zoot suits. During the riot, the servicemen beat the young Mexican Americans and removed their clothing. Police looked the other way during the assault. This picture doesn't do the severity of this riot justice, but it should help you remember the important points for your exam. Servicemen beat young Mexican Americans who wore zoot suits. And that's it for this image. Just remember the American rug in this cozy home, and you'll ace any question on the World War II American home front.